Everyone's calling Candace Owens an anti-Semite, and I wanted to see if this was actually true. So I watched 72 hours of her podcast. 72 hours! And now I can answer the question and debunk all of her lies, but also point out this one area where she might actually be right.
The people that are behind these wars can trace their family lineage back to the Bible.
These are not true Jews. They're this literal satanic cult that
worshipped the Jewish Kabbalah.
People died in this castle. Blood, ritual, sacrifice,
because that's what you do when you worship the Kabbalah.
This is not libelous, so you can spare me. This is blood libel.
I uncovered so much more than a few edgy statements. She's developed one of the most crazy conspiracy theories I've ever heard. What's even crazier is she's based it on 2 books, one of which she didn't even read. But I did, and I'm going to utterly debunk her lies. Now, Candace has almost 20 million followers, making her one of the most influential political voices in the world. So what she says matters. But here's the thing. This year, more than 65% of her videos mention the word Jew or Jewish. Is that normal? Or is she, a little obsessed with the Jews? To answer this question, I'm going to retrace her footsteps and show exactly how she arrived at her crazy conclusions. You're going to want to watch this. Back in 2017, Candace started releasing videos aimed at persuading Black Americans to leave the Democratic Party. At that point, she hardly mentioned Jews, and when she did, it was relatively positive.
The Jewish community had the odds stacked against them after World War II. They were escaping Germany with the clothes on their back, and look at where they are in the world right now. They did that by building a community of people that supported one another.
Back then, she clearly admired the Jewish community, and she later explained why.
I grew up in a town with a lot of Jewish people. My entire life, my best friend, by coincidence, I never even think of them as Jewish, but they were all Jewish, Best friend Denise in high school, best friend Ashley in college. I've attended more Rosh Hashanah dinners. It's weird how many Rosh Hashanah dinners I've been at. I know full Jewish prayers because I played the daughter in Fiddler on the Roof when I was in after college, worked for an Orthodox Jewish family. Kids went to Rodef Shalom for school. I was friends with all of the, when I lived in New York, I dated and lived with a Jewish guy for 3 years. His brother was an Orthodox Jew, and we had a mezuzah.
Things first took a turn in 2018 when Candace made a comment about Hitler that caused an uproar.
Yeah, I agree. I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. I think that it gets, the definition gets poisoned by elitists that actually want globalism. Globalism is what I don't want. So when you think about, whenever we say nationalism, the first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. He was a National Socialist, but if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany. He wanted to globalize. He wanted everybody to be German, everybody to be speaking German, everybody to look a different way. That's not nationalism.
People didn't react well to this clip. They thought that she was either washing over the Holocaust, minimizing it, or even worse, describing it as fine. So the public backlash was loud and understandable, with one congressman even playing it at a congressional hearing on racism.
I don't know Miss Owens. I'm not going to characterize her. I'm going to let her own words do the talking. So I'm going to play for you the first 30 seconds of a statement she made about Adolf Hitler.
If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine.
She passionately defended her position at that hearing, explaining how her words had been taken out of context deliberately.
He cut off and you didn't hear the question that was asked of me. So the question that was asked of me was pertaining to whether or not I believed in nationalism and that nationalism was bad. And what I responded to was that I do not believe that we should be characterizing Hitler as a nationalist. He was a homicidal, psychopathic maniac.
Cards on the table? Personally, I believe her. I think she was trying to defend nationalism, but her defense was so weak and so clumsy that she accidentally glossed over the horrors of the Holocaust. Now, the public outcry was loud and justifiable, but this outcry then became the pivotal moment in her villain origin story. Years later, she would go on to explain how she felt betrayed by the Jewish community, who she'd always stood by and who she'd always supported.
So it's very bizarre. And after going through it and seeing that people that I had defended for years were so quick to say, you are not allowed to even talk about nationalism and Adolf Hitler, somehow that could be construed as anti-Semitism, and none of the voices that I had given my voice to were defending me, didn't feel good, didn't like it at all. You know, does it make you quick to want to defend people that are not going to return the favor when the time comes?
If this feeling of betrayal was the beginning, the events that followed sent her spiraling. In October 2022, Kanye West, one of her closest friends, made a series of anti-Semitic remarks.
I'm a bit sleepy tonight, but when I wake up, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. That was the tweet. And people subsequently demanded that the tweet be taken down for anti-Semitism. Now, if you are an honest person, you did not think this tweet was anti-Semitic. You did not think that he wrote this tweet because he hates or wants to genocide Jewish people. This does not represent the beginning of the Holocaust. That's if you're an honest person, you will admit that.
Come off it. Obviously, it was anti-Semitic. The question is, why didn't Candace think so?
I have given you my opinion that something that is incoherent can't be anti-Semitism.
What? So because it doesn't make sense to her, she thinks it couldn't be anti-Semitic? This is such a bizarre stance. It's like claiming a Klansman can only be racist if their bigoted insults are coherent. Someone should really tell Candace that racism and incoherence often go hand in hand.
Well, in fact, they're trying to now say I'm anti-Semitic. Shut up. I don't care.
By now, she was beginning the spiral.
And we've seen this phenomenon, I've covered it on this show, hoax after hoax of individuals that are being accused of anti-Semitism who have not explicitly said anything against Jewish people.
In some cases, sure, she might have been right. There were probably some people who were wrongly accused of anti-Semitism. For instance, her defense of Jamie Foxx and Bradley Cooper were justifiable. They probably weren't anti-Semitic. But as time went on, she started defending anyone and everyone, no matter how blatant their anti-Semitism was.
So Kyrie Irving, at the time, he still might be a basketball player for the Brooklyn Nets, tweeted a link to a documentary, absent commentary. He didn't tweet this and say, I agree with this. He didn't tweet this and say, like, I disagree with this. He just tweeted a link. And the next thing you knew, he was a mainstream story and he was at risk of losing his job as a basketball player. And I remember watching this going, how could this documentary have caused this much craziness in the media? And then I realized that the point of the documentary that it was making that upset, and this is why the ADL got involved, was the documentary makers, that is, were alleging that the current Jewish people that are in Israel are not, in fact, biblical Jews, and instead that the people that were brought over in the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to America were the original Hebrews, okay?
What she deliberately left out of her defense of Kyrie is the insane anti-Semitism in the film. For instance, it incorrectly claims that Hitler said,
America has stolen the Jews, the jewels of God, his jewelry, the Negroes. They are the true Hebrews. What a foolish move and a direct challenge to God. And they plan on moving these false white Jews into a state of Israel, because the white Jews know that the Negroes are the real children of Israel, and to keep America's secret, the Jews will blackmail America. They will extort America. Their plan for world domination won't work if the Negroes know who they are.
That's the pro-Hitler broadcast that she's defending. Speaking of which, this is Candace's comments on the Holocaust.
We are not allowed to discuss Adolf Hitler. Why? That is crazy. And what's really interesting is that when you even discuss, you would assume, since that's the entire focus, the nucleus of our idea of who a bad person is, step aside Satan because we've got Adolf Hitler. When you assume that people, therefore, must know a lot about World War II, you then find out that actually Americans know nothing about World War II. They have taught us World War II history like we're children. Like, yes. I mean, it's everything they've told us. Virtually everything they told us is either not true or a snippet of the truth or omitting something that would make us question more of their narrative. And so, yeah, imagine my surprise. I know I've showed you this on the show before, but when I actually then started learning real history and I got out of the bubble, and part of that learning process for me when I started looking into it was coming across a huge fact that we ethnically, the Allies, ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans. And then to know that prior to World War II, there's a book written by a guy, last name Kaufman, I'm blanking on the first name, where he said it's Germany must perish. Yeah. Like they literally wanted to get rid of Anglo-Saxons.
Okay, I wish I could give her the benefit of the doubt. but I can't. This is indefensible. She's basically justifying the Holocaust. She's implying that the Holocaust was a reaction to some Jews wanting to genocide Anglo-Saxons. This is such a perverse inversion of what happened. It was the Jews who were genocided, not the Germans, Candace. Now about this book, it was written by an American Jew in response to Hitler's death squads carrying out their actual genocide of Jews. It was written by Theodor Kaufmann and he published it in 1941, not before the war she claims, but during it. It was a reaction to the genocide. But by now, Candace was so far down this rabbit hole that she'd defend anyone accused of anti-Semitism. So when the notorious anti-Semite Nick Fuentes tweeted that the US government was controlled by Jews, guess who rushed to his defense?
Somebody asked the question, we know that Joe Biden is not in control of the White House, so who is in control of the White House? And Nick Fuentes wrote a one-word response, Jews. He's saying Jews are in control of the White House. And that garnered a response from Jordan Peterson calling him a psychopathic rat. Now, we all know that Nick Fuentes has branded himself as somebody who expressly hates Zionism. He expressly hates Israel. And he is saying that Jews in the White House are now obviously in control because Joe Biden is not. Now, to be fair, the Times of Israel has noted in the past, this is an actual article from them, all the Jews Biden has tapped for top roles in his new administration. This is from back in 2021. So it seems a weird tweet for him to be so disturbed about.
This is so disgusting. Jews don't run the US government. It's true they are slightly overrepresented, but there's a huge difference between overrepresentation and control. The majority of Biden's cabinet are Christians, but no one's saying that Christians control the Biden administration. As for the actual article that she quotes, this wasn't for a second suggesting that Jews control the government. It was celebrating Jewish representation. As I'm sure you'd expect, her fanatic comments began to attract the attention of the media and of organizations that combat anti-Semitism like the ADL. But instead of stepping back and reflecting, she doubled down and started developing conspiratorial theories about the ADL's power and influence.
This is what happened when I was effectively kicked out. It was like a button was pressed. I was fed to the ADL. Overnight, it seemed literally overnight, someone pressed a button and there was a full court press effort to cancel Candace Owens by trying to convince the people that she just went crazy and anti-Semitic. We have seen the strength of the ADL. Trump couldn't get this thing done. He wanted to ban TikTok, because he had concerns about China. Suddenly, John Greenblatt swoops in and it's gone. TikTok has got to go, or at least it passes in the House. And immediately you start to realize who's actually controlling Congress.
This obsession with the ADL grew and it expanded into an even larger conspiracy that revolved around powerful Jews who control the media and the government. She began to talk of this Jewish gang that controls the media, and this would later then develop into her craziest conspiracy theory yet.
It's interesting because he also was bringing up to me, I'm referring to Kanye West now, was bringing up to me the idea that there were these gangs in Hollywood. And this is something that keeps rearing its ugly head. And now it's being called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I spoke about the plausibility that there were gangs, obviously, because so many artists keep saying that there are. Michael Jackson among them said that there were a gang of people that were colluding to ruin his life. In the Black community, we've got the Bloods and we've got the Crips. Well, imagine if the Bloods and the Crips were doing horrific things, and then every time a person spoke out about it, the Bloods and the Crips would call those people racist. What if that is what is happening right now in Hollywood, if there is just a very small ring of specific people who are using the fact that they are Jewish to shield themselves from any criticism?
Once she thought she'd identified this Jewish ring, this Jewish gang, it wasn't a giant step for her to then expand the influence of this ring even further.
We know that there was once a president who wanted to make AIPAC register as foreign, and he ended up shot. Israel has too strong a hold on our media. And yet there are so many people who know, like I know and like you know, that if you are in media, you got to be careful talking about Israel. Why is that? I want to be clear to you guys. I'm going to be honest with you because everybody's noticing it. Every single political commentator in America, every single one of them knows this. that if you do not step out and say things that are radically pro-Israel, or if you are too quiet on certain narratives and they want you to be radically pro-Israel, you can lose everything. An entire mob will assemble. They'll write piece after piece after piece until you subjugate.
Okay, she's clearly implying Zionists killed JFK and that they control the media. By now, she is clearly spiraling out of control. But buckle up, as it's about to get even crazier. She's about to share the most sensational aspect of her conspiracy theory. She made up a theory after researching Sigmund Freud, who she believed was responsible for the moral decay of the West.
Now, I learned about this quite accidentally, by the way. I didn't mean to learn about this. I was so shocked. I was coming apart when I learned that Sigmund Freud created psychoanalysis to protect pedophiles.
This is going to be wild.
I wrote, the entire field of psychology was built by pedophiles and perverts. That Sigmund Freud is viewed as anything more than a manipulative, sexual pervert who created theories to cover the crimes of his pedophile friends is quite frankly stunning to me. Now, how do we know this? Candace, where are you getting this fact that wasn't introduced to me via the public education system? Well, I want you guys to look up, if you're interested, this scholar. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Masson, and he was the project director for the Sigmund Freud archives. His theory is that when Freud realized, through his work, speaking with children, that a lot of them had been sexually assaulted, and that was leading to their various mental disturbances, Freud presented that information to his peers, and his peers got upset. So what did Freud do after he presents this information and the entire Vienna Psychiatric Society says, no, we don't like this thesis, when all of his friends are going, this doesn't work? Well, then Freud does a complete 180, and he starts blaming the children for their memories, positing theories that children were actually sexual by nature. And then the psychiatric community loved Freud. They were like, oh my God, you're so amazing. We're gonna put you everywhere. This is just so contemporary and thoughtful. It's just groundbreaking. Yeah. So going back to that young gentleman, the Dr. Masson, who was going, hey, I've gone through the archives and this looks pretty bad. This is a cover-up, actually. And guess what happened after that? Masson was dismissed from his role as director altogether. He was dismissed from a person that was allowed to access the archives anymore. He, after he gets kicked out, decides to publish a book, and you should read it, called The Assault of Truth.
So I actually did read it, all 346 pages. And surprise, surprise, it doesn't say what she claims. What it basically says is that Freud initially believed his patient's hysteria stemmed from repressed memories of sexual abuse, a theory that he called the seduction hypothesis. But he then later abandoned this theory after the psychiatric community told him that they didn't think it was believable. Now, the book draws its conclusions from Freud's correspondence with Wilhelm Fleiss, Emma Eckstein, and Sandor Ferenczi. Remember these names, as they're the stars of a crazy plot twist. But first, let's debunk her claims.
And he had a very strange relationship, you can look this up, with his best friend, Wilhelm Fleiss, who, if you're interested in Wilhelm Fleiss, sexually abused his own son, Robert Fleiss.
Her evidence for this is that Masson speculates that in one of Robert's books, he hints that he had repressed memories of his father abusing him. Now, even if this is correct, Freud wouldn't have known about it when he renounced the theory, as Robert wrote the book half a century later. Now, despite Candace's assertions, Masson doesn't say that Freud was covering for abuse. Instead, he suggests that there was an unwillingness from the psychiatric community to believe that such abuse could occur in perfectly ordinary households. One person even went as far as calling it a scientific fairy tale. Candace was so far from what the book actually says, it made me question if she'd even read it.
Well, guess what he did? This wonderful guy, Jeffrey Masson, he still wrote a book referred to as The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory. And I want to be very clear, I have not yet read that book. It's on my list, my long list of books to read.
Wait, what? She mentioned this theory in 17 videos before admitting half a year later she hadn't even read the book.
I thought, how could this be? How could Sigmund Freud do this? How could the world not be speaking about this?
And I landed upon a book. I believe the book was written, and you can look this up, scholars, David Bacon. And he got quite interested in the Jewish mystical tradition and learned that psychoanalytic concepts actually derived from Kabbalah, okay? What he discovered in his work, right, and when you read that book, you will see this, was that Sigmund Freud was a Kabbalist.
Great, another book I've had to read. Thanks, Candace. This one was 318 pages long, and in it, Bacon makes some pretty outlandish claims, like Freud's development of psychoanalysis was significantly influenced by Jewish mystical traditions. Seriously, particularly Kabbalistic thought. For those that are interested, the Kabbalah is a mystical Jewish tradition that explains the nature of God and creation. One of its primary texts is the Zohar, and it's supposed to bring man close to God. So, what is Bacon's proof that psychoanalysis is based on the Kabbalah? I'll share a couple of examples. When Freud had to name one of his patients to protect her anonymity, the only feminine name he could think of was Dora. So, what deep and mystical truth did Bacon infer from this? That Freud must have been a Kabbalist because Dora rhymes with Torah. I kid you not. It gets better. In another example, he claims that Freud's idea of the unconscious mind comes from the Kabbalistic concept of the hidden knowledge of God. Seriously, this is the level of scholarship. But let's continue hearing Candace's thoughts on the book.
And he starts speaking at length about this great Jewish schism that happened when a bunch of Jewish people believed that Jacob Frank was their Messiah, until they realized, and actually Jews were the first one who expelled the Frankists. They said, get the heck out of here, what are you doing? After they had a sexual ritual, they were actually expelled from the region. And at that moment, what the Frankists did was there was a mass conversion because they taught this as a religious rite. You have to deceive and you have to infiltrate. They converted into the Catholic faith. Now, Jacob Frank had a daughter named Ava Frank, and let me tell you how disgusting this Frankist religion is. He had sex with her, was incestuous, openly incestuous, of course, because this is what their sexual rituals were all about, and he deemed her essentially to be the unholy Mary. Now, how powerful was Jacob Frank? Well, the rumors, which I have not been able to find an actual fact on this, is that he was sponsored by the Rothschilds. Now, again, that's a rumor. What I can tell you is he definitely had a lot of money because he purchased a castle. In Offenbach, Germany, Jacob Frank had a castle. Him and his daughter lived in this castle, and people that were Frankists came to them. They worshipped them. They made sacrifices to them. And of course, they had sexual rituals. This is all, I'm telling you, all of this stuff, it should be blowing your mind. And unbelievably, it's all true.
Well, not quite. I mean, it's partially true. The stuff about the Rothschilds is obviously nonsense. But what she said about the Frankists is pretty close to the mark. The Frankists were a heretical religious sect led by a degenerate false messiah called Jacob Frank. His cult rejected the Torah and the Talmud as spiritually outdated, and instead they twisted Kabbalistic concepts to justify their deviant practices. For instance, they believed that by engaging in forbidden sexual acts, they'd bring about a new spiritual age. So the Jewish community obviously excommunicated him because his behavior violates Jewish law and is degenerate, and in response he then apostated to Catholicism, as did around 2,000 of his followers. Those that remained loyal to the cult continued to secretly practice Frankism while maintaining the outward appearance of religious Jews or of Jewish converts to Catholicism.
Now, America, if you're thinking, okay, well, Candace, that may have happened in the 1700s, but there's no way that there are Frankists in America, I'm going to ask you something right now. Pivot your browser, open up your browser, and I want you to look up the first, and again, I'm doing air quotations here, Jewish Supreme Court Justice. The first Jewish. He's not Jewish. He doesn't worship the Torah. I'll tell you what he worships when you look up. His name is Louis Brandeis. You guys know him because you're thinking Brandeis University. I've heard of that. Well, it's a very powerful family. We had a Supreme Court justice named Louis Brandeis. And then as you scroll through his Wikipedia, you're going to learn that he kept a photo of Ava Frank on his desk, the unholy the non-virgin Ava Frank, who from this castle had sexual rituals, incest with her father, who had people bringing her gifts, that the Brandeis family were committed Frankists. They believed in pedophilia. They believed in this as a sacrament, okay? They believed in blood rituals on holidays. They believed that you had to sacrifice people. All of this is in the books, okay? They believed people died in this castle. Blood ritual sacrifice. And this is not libelous. So you can spare me, this is blood libel. Because again, these people are no more Jews than they are Christians.
First of all, Candace, that is a blood libel. You're saying that Jews who pretended to convert to Catholicism are performing blood ritual sacrifices. That's the literal definition of a blood libel. And for the record, no academics claim that Frankists engaged in human sacrifice. That's just you. But blood libels aside, she mentioned that Louis Brandeis was a Frankist. Now, I'd never heard this before, so I decided to look into it. And what I found shocked me. As insane as it sounds, there was some truth to her claim. After Eva Frank's death, Prague became the center of the Frankist cult, and it was led by the city's most prominent Jewish families, like Wieler, Dembitz, and Frankel. Now, guess where Louis's family came from? Prague. And guess what their surnames were? Wieler, Dembitz, and Frankel. In fact, Gershom Scholem records that his grandfather was the last known convert to Frankism, while the Wielers led the cult. Another surprising fact was that his wife, Alice Goldmark, also belonged to a Frankist family. More shockingly, Louis and Alice were second cousins. Their grandfather was Rabbi Aaron Ber Hirschweiler. Now, rather than hide this family secret, Josephine Goldmark, Alice's sister, published her grandfather's last will and testament, where he praises his ancestors as the standard bearers of the true Jewish faith, explicitly stating,
"The sect to which the Wieler's, in common with many of their race in Bohemia, Poland, and other countries, devoted their enthusiasm and a large part of their fortunes, was a successor to earlier mystic organizations. It was founded in 1755 at a time of fierce persecutions by a man named Jacob Frank."
Now, in my opinion, the openness of their family's past and the assimilation of their children, and Louis returning to Judaism in later life, as his uncle did as well, suggests to me that they didn't practice Frankism. But Candace had been kind of right. Louis Brandeis was surprisingly the descendant of a Frankist family. But now for the final installment of her crazy conspiracy theory.
If we knew the history of the ADL, if we could learn that on Wikipedia, no one would support the ADL. Because the ADL, factually speaking, okay, was founded to protect a pedophile named Leo Frank. This is how the ADL was born. They were born of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith was this Freemason chapter that was based in Atlanta, and Leo Frank was the president of that chapter. He was incredibly wealthy. He ran a local pencil factory. During Passover of 1913, he viciously raped and murdered a young Catholic girl named Mary Fagan. And yet, if you look up this entry on the Leo Frank case on Wikipedia, again, the ADL's controlled it forever, they are still trying to shift the blame of this horrific murder.
I'm just going to quickly interject here. She has absolutely no idea if Leo Frank was guilty or not, as the case occurred over a century ago. Now, I'll explain what we do know. In 1913, Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager, was convicted of the murder of Mary Fagan. Now, this conviction rested heavily on the testimony of Jim Conley, an African-American janitor who worked at the factory, and he'd claimed that he'd helped Leo Frank move the body. Now, doubts were cast on this testimony and on his credibility as his story kept on changing throughout the trial. But despite this, Leo Frank was still found guilty and sentenced to death. But then that sentence was commuted after new evidence emerged, and the commutation of his sentence provoked an anti-Semitic riot, and a lynch mob broke into the prison, pulled out Leo Frank, and hung him from a tree.
They are still trying to sell to the public that it's plausible that the black janitor did it. That is explicitly racist, okay? You have to be a moron, and I'm saying this with love in my heart, to believe that in 1913 Atlanta, okay, in the segregated South, that the judicial system decided to collude, right, to protect a black janitor, a poor black janitor.
It's actually appalling how oblivious she is to historical anti-Semitism. Take the Jeffersonian, who were literally publishing articles about rich Jews and blood libels at that time. They whipped the public into an anti-Semitic frenzy. Take this article that they published weeks before the lynching.
It is a peculiar and portentous thing that one race of men, and one only, should be able to convulse the world by a system of newspaper agitation and suppression. The Bayless case in Russia was equally remarkable. A Gentile boy was found dead. Bayless, a Russian Jew, was accused of kidnapping the little boy and emptying his blood vessels of their contents in order that it might be used in a religious sacrifice.
She really thinks that these people would never side against Jews? They're literally publishing articles about Jewish ritual murder.
It had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. In fact, when he was convicted, 2 of the judges, and they all convicted him, not a single person found him not guilty. That's how overwhelming the evidence was. But 2 of the jury members, 2 of the jury members were actually Jewish.
This is the jury. Not one of them was Jewish. So much of what she says is so easily fact-checked.
There's little tidbits, of course, that are not included in the Wikipedia entry, like the fact that they hated Christians. They did. Okay, that's a fact. You can actually look at this book that was written as the comprehensive account of the Leo Frank case by a man named Leonard Dinerstein. And he shows this passage that Leo Frank's mother stood up and had an outburst in the middle of the hearing, referring to them as Christian dogs. Mrs. Frank, no, nor you either, you Christian dog.
That's actually not what the book says. It's not what the newspaper said. If you actually paused on the image that she shared, it says that 2 newspapers recorded her screaming, "You dogs," and only one of them recorded, "You Christian dogs." There was obviously a lot of noise in the courtroom and it wasn't clear what she said. Moreover, this is yet another book that Candace hasn't read. If she had, she'd have known that Dinerstein thought that Frank was innocent. This is literally how he opens the book.
I have no doubts. Frank was innocent.
But justifying the lynching of a Jew that actually led to the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan wasn't enough for Candace. She had to take it even further.
This horrific murder, which I believe was a ritualistic murder that took place because I believe that he was a Frankist. He descended from Jacob Frank. I brought to my audience the fact, the indisputable fact, the fact that I learned from Gershom Scholem, an Israeli historian, that Leo Frank, just so you guys know, is a descendant, a direct descendant of Jacob Frank.
So I've read Gershom Scholem, and clearly she hasn't, as he doesn't mention Leo Frank anywhere. Why would he? Sure, Leo and Jacob share the same surname, but that's it. It's like me claiming that Candace is related to Jesse Owens because she's black and called Owens. But she kind of got Louis Brandeis right, and I was a little bit nervous, so I decided to investigate Leo's family tree, and unsurprisingly, I couldn't find any Frankists. So next I then checked Freud's family tree, and again, no Frankists. But then the unthinkable happened. Incredibly, she'd stumbled upon a half-truth. What I'm about to share has never been published before, and when I discovered it, I couldn't believe she was kind of right. So remember when I said to take note of Freud's friends, Fleiss, Eckstein, and Ferenczi? Well, when I looked into the family of Wilhelm Fleiss, Freud's closest friend, I discovered that his wife was a Bondi. Now, they were one of Prague's most prominent Frankist families, and coincidentally, her great-grandfather married Louis Brandeis's great-grand-aunt. There's absolutely no way that Candace could have known this, and so I was feeling a little spooked out, so I looked up Emma Eckstein. And again, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was the second cousin of Louis Brandeis. Now, this was getting crazy. So I decided to check the other person from the book, Sandor Ferenczi, and guess what? He was born Sandor Frankel, and he descended from Rabbi Ebenschitz, a famous rabbi who'd been accused of being a Sabbatean 3 centuries earlier by Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Zichron Livracha. Coincidentally, Sandor's first wife's husband was a cousin of Louis Brandeis. Had Candace Owens got it right? Had she somehow uncovered a secret satanic Frankist cabal? No, obviously not. The reality isn't that exciting. So I spent weeks and weeks researching Frankist family trees, and what I learned was that most of the prominent families remained Frankist for a few generations, but by the beginning of the 20th century, they'd almost completely assimilated, and actually, they went on to make incredible contributions to humanity. So whenever I dug into one of these family trees, I found Nobel Prize winning scientists, business magnates, politicians, and philosophers. I'll give you an example. Remember the Bondi family from before? Well, their assimilated descendants included physicists like Wolfgang Pauli, Hermann Bondi, and the Kalmus brothers, along with pioneers of the Reform movement like Rabbi Jonah Weiss and his mother. Now, these accomplishments are easily explained. You see, in Prague, it was the wealthiest and most educated Jewish families that were swept away by this cult. And this cult rejected orthodoxy, it rejected the rules, it kind of was imbued with this revolutionary spirit. So it was unsurprising to find that descendants of these wealthy intellectual families were at the heart of scientific and philosophical change. Now, that's the reality, but let's compare that to what Candace says.
My theory is that part of the reason that there are so many wars is because they're destroying history. Right?
Yes.
They're destroying old relics. You don't know where you come from. The fact that I can't go back more than a couple of generations,
Yep.
but the people that are behind these wars know exactly. They can trace their family lineage back to the Bible. They're keeping their tribe intact while they're essentially using multicultural and war and open borders to just kind of deplete everybody else's.
Yeah.
And then when I started studying more about like the Kabbalah and how this came from Babylon,
that these people that worship Baphomet and this transgender deity, that the Kabbalah, this Lurianic Kabbalah recognizes this, and what they're trying to do through deception is to cast a spell on society to bring everybody into their consciousness. That is what it was explicitly their aims, by the way. This is the explicit aims of the Frankist cult.
Now, she is quite literally as mad as a box of frogs, but incredibly, by some complete fluke, she was able to identify something that no one else has before, and that is that some of the pioneers of psychoanalysis actually descended from Frankist families. Now, I'm not sure how important that is, but I would like to clarify that there is no Frankist cabal targeting Candace, and Leo's only connection to Frankism was his surname. And the ADL was actually established to combat the type of libels that she's now spreading. But the fact that she got that little bit right is quite incredible. But here's my message to you, Candace. I will happily debate all of your dodgy views if you have the courage to do a live stream with me. And to everyone else, if you're still watching this, please share this challenge with Candace, as I'd love to debate her.